Hi, and welcome to Week 9 of History 363, Life and Death on the Eastern Front. My name is Robert Greene. Last week, we talked about the question of motivation as it pertained to the perpetrators of the mass killing of civilians on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. And we considered whether we might regard the German men who committed these crimes as ordinary men or as willing executioners. And this week we turn to another thorny question in the historical memory of the war, the question of collaboration. And one of the most sensitive issues in the ongoing debates in Poland today concerning wartime collaboration has to do, as you might imagine, with the question of Polish-Jewish relations during the war. And I'll preface my remarks by noting that this is still, to this very day, a very contentious issue. It's a question that still hangs over Polish public life and historical memory, even now, decades after. Even to raise the topic in Poland is to broach a very, very touchy subject. Many Jewish survivors of the Holocaust have made some rather shocking accusations against the Poles. I'll share with you just one such story. If I will, here we are. Taken from the post-war memoirs of a Polish Jew named Naftali Salschutz, the youngest of 9 children. Here you see young Naftali Salschutz. He was born into a well-to-do, religiously observant Jewish family in the town of Kalbuszowa in southeast Poland, a town with a population of a few thousand, half of them ethnic Poles, half of them Jews. In 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, Naftali Salschutz was 19 years old, and he recalled in his memoirs his reaction. As a Polish patriot, he writes, I felt obligated to defend the country from enemies. The Polish army recruiting officer simply laughed. We don't have enough uniforms for our regular army. Where are we going to find one for you? i.e., where are we going to find one for a Jew? After Poland fell to the Germans, Naftali Salschutz's father was taken by the Nazis out of his home and shot dead in the yard. Naftali and his remaining family, along with the surviving Jews of Kalbuszowa, were resettled in a ghetto in the town of Rzeszów, 20 miles to the north. And here you see a photo of Naftali Salschutz in the ghetto at the age of 2021. He agonized over the decision of whether to remain with his family and face certain death, or to risk it all and try to escape. And he wrote later, the chances for survival increased beyond the ghetto. But still, this outside world, Poland, was savagely hostile. Almost everyone was on the lookout for us, Jews. And he doesn't just mean Germans here. Few Gentiles, that is to say non-Jews, ethnic Poles in this case, few Gentiles were willing to hide Jews, and usually only for large sums of money. It was becoming painfully obvious that despite some exceptions, the Jews could count on no one other than themselves. Few Gentiles cared whether we lived or died. Most were eager to be rid of us. I think that's an incredibly telling line, which relates to the readings that we're going to be discussing this week. Few Gentiles cared whether we Jews lived or died. Most were eager to be rid of us. Eventually, Salschutz did escape the ghetto. In October of 1942, he and some of his comrades organized the escape of some 55 of their fellow Jews. The rest of his family, however, was not so lucky. His mother, his 5 sisters, and his brothers-in-law, his nieces and nephews, were all sent to the death camp at Belzec, where they were exterminated. After escaping from the ghetto, Salschutz took refuge with a sympathetic Pole, who sold him a revolver, which Salschutz paid for with money he had saved up from his meager wages as a manual worker in the ghetto. Now armed, he joined up with a unit of underground partisans fighting the Nazis, blowing up German railroads, mills, and police stations, and he describes in his memoirs the fate of his unit, mostly Jews. He said our group, that had once numbered 125, was now reduced to 6. Most had been killed not by our sworn enemies, the Germans, but by the treacherous Poles, among whom we had lived for centuries. Clearly, the AK, the Home Army, of which we spoke a few weeks ago, the Polish resistance, the underground resistance movement fighting against German occupation. Clearly, the AK was intent on completing what the Germans had started. Sad to say, I was betrayed more than once by Poles who professed to be my friends. Caught between the Germans and the Poles as if in a nutcracker, it followed that sooner or later we would all be crushed. After a series of amazing adventures and close calls, Salschutz survived the war and emigrated eventually to the United States, where he Americanized his name to Norman Salsitz and wrote a series of memoirs about his extraordinary life. He died in 2006, leaving a collection of more than 1,000 pre-war and wartime photographs to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Now, as you might expect, a lot of Poles, ethnic Poles, bristle when they hear stories like that of Naftali Salschutz, when they hear accusations of Poles engaging in unscrupulous dealings with the Jews, or, as Salschutz writes in his memoirs, of members of the Polish resistance, the Home Army, the AK, murdering Jews in cold blood. They get angry because these kinds of stories, in many ways, destabilize and undercut the patriotic narrative of heroic Polish resistance. After the war, with the establishment of a communist government in Poland in 1947, and through the fall of the communist regime in 1989 and beyond, Poland and the Polish people, regardless of the ideology of the regime, be it communist or liberal democratic system such as exists today, since 1945, Poles have celebrated their status as both a nation of victims who suffered at the hands of the Nazis, and suffered greatly as we've seen, and also as a nation of resistance, a nation of men and women who pushed back and fought back against the Nazis. So thinking about Polish-Jewish relations during the war, which were rocky at best and bloody at worst, destabilizes that heroic narrative somewhat, and it does so in uncomfortable ways. Our readings this week and some of the supplementary materials that I posted on the Moodle page make this quite clear, I think. For example, if we go back to 1987, Jan Błącki, shown here, a Polish historian and literary critic at Jagiellonian University in Poland, published an article in 1987 in the Polish magazine Tygodnik Powszechny, the Weekly General, a sort of liberal-leaning Catholic publication. Incidentally, the first publication in the world to interview Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, upon his election as Pope. And Błącki's article, published in 1987, was entitled, in English translation, "The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto." The title was taken from a wartime poem by the great Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. And in this piece, "The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto," Błącki suggested that he and his fellow Poles, ethnic Poles, bore some degree of moral culpability for the extermination of Polish Jewry. Błącki wrote, "I believe that the Holocaust is a call for us Poles to take a new look at ourselves as people who, albeit in a very small way, allowed it to take place." The public reaction to Błącki's article in 1987 was swift and angry. The magazine, the newspaper, Tygodnik Powszechny, received hundreds of letters from readers all across Poland, most of them outraged. What did Błącki mean by suggesting that the Poles had allowed it, the Holocaust, to take place, as he said? And Tygodnik Powszechny, the Weekly General, published a whole series of these letters in response to Błącki's piece. And again, this is 1987, the twilight years of the communist regime in Poland. And the exchange of letters that took place in the pages of Tygodnik Powszechny and other magazines and newspapers across Poland pro and con on the Błonski question was undoubtedly one of the most contested and vibrant public exchanges on a question that had really not been broached publicly in Poland to a degree such as this since the end of the war. The Polish journalist Witold Rymanowski accused Błonski of, quote, slandering the Polish nation. Another key figure to come out against Błonski was a figure named Władysław Siwonowicki, shown here. He had fought in the AK during the war. He was later a key figure in the anti-communist solidarity movement of the early 1980s. Siwonowicki was a hero to many Poles. Siwonowicki wrote that Błonski's essay represented a, quote, virulent anti-Polish propaganda campaign. And in his critique of the Błonski article, Siwonowicki writes, I am proud of my nation's stance in every respect during the period of occupation. Błonski's article and the flurry of responses that it generated are available in English translation, edited by the British historian Anthony Polonsky in a book titled My Brother's Keeper. And I've included a few links to some of the key articles in this debate, including Błonski and Siwonowicki's rejoinder under this week's supplementary materials. So if you're interested in reading more, this is probably the first place to look, I think. Now the question here, the question at stake, Polish complicity in the fate of the Jewish people, is very, very complex. The examples of Naftali Salschutz and the Błonski debate suggest that there are two extreme positions here, right? Of blame on the one hand and of denial on the other. The American historian Joshua Zimmerman refers to these two camps as the condemners and the apologists. And the truth of the matter, I think, the truth of the matter of Polish-Jewish relations in the war lies somewhere in between these extremes. First, to the credit of the Poles, it should be emphasized that if a Polish Jew survived the Holocaust, at some point that Jew was aided by a Pole in some way, by offering food, shelter, so forth. There was essentially no other way. In Israel today, at Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, established in 1953, at Yad Vashem there's a special commemoration on site for those Gentiles, non-Jews, who tried to defend Jews during World War II. And here, in the Garden of the Righteous Among the Nations, there are names of those Gentiles who tried to help Jews during the war. There are more names from Poland than from any other country. There are more Poles represented in the Garden of the Righteous than from any other country. Of the nearly 25,000 Gentiles named by the State of Israel as righteous among the nations for their service to the Jewish people during the war, 25% of them are Poles. And some of their stories are remarkable. Among them, Irina Zendler, shown here, a Polish nurse who smuggled 2,500 Jewish children to safety out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Tadeusz Pankiewicz, a Polish pharmacist who operated the only pharmacy, the only medical dispensary in the ghetto of Krakow. He distributed medicine to the Jews there free of charge, saved countless lives. Erek Lipinski, a Polish satirist and cartoonist, who's famous in the 1930s, he forged documents and ID papers that allowed Polish Jews to disguise their identity from the Nazi authorities. He himself was arrested by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz. He survived. Maria Katarba, known as the Angel of Auschwitz, a Polish Catholic prisoner at the camp, she helped to smuggle food and medicine into Auschwitz via a network of underground couriers who were working with the AK, the Polish Home Army. Anna Barkowska, better known as Mother Bertranda. She was a Polish Catholic nun who sheltered 17 young Jewish resistance fighters in her convent outside of Vilnius. When some of the nuns in the convent expressed their reservations about harboring Jews, Mother Bertrande threatened them with expulsion from the convent. And she herself left soon thereafter to live and work herself among the Jews of the Vilnius ghetto, smuggling in ammunition and hand grenades. When the Nazis liquidated the Vilnius ghetto, and when the Jews of the Vilnius ghetto were sent to the death camps, Mother Bertrande herself was sent to a labor camp, where she spent the duration of the war. And here you see a photo of Mother Bertrande many years later. Here she is, second from the left. This photo taken in Israel in the 1980s when she attended the ceremony, numbering her among the righteous of the nations. Seated to her left, right here, is Abbe Kovner, leader of the Jewish resistance unit that she saved. Kovner himself later became a journalist and writer in Israel and was a witness for the prosecution at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961. These examples go on and on. One Jewish scholar of the Holocaust estimates that upwards of 2.5% of the ethnic Polish population sheltered Jews, harbored Jews, or in some way helped them to escape destruction during the war. Now, 2.5% of the ethnic Polish population may not seem like a lot, but that works out to more than 600,000 men and women who literally risked their lives to save Jews. The penalty imposed by the Nazis was summary execution. Historians estimate that at least 50,000 Poles were killed by the Nazis for sheltering Jews, often in makeshift cellars like this one, in the basement of a building in Warsaw. Similarly, the Polish government in exile in London, the so-called London government, issued numerous statements and reports during the war describing in detail the Nazi persecution of the Jews in an effort to alert the world to what was going on. The London government, in fact, cooperated with Jewish émigré associations and relief organizations to try and send aid to the Jews confined in the Polish ghettos. It was the London government, in fact, that first received verified reports about what was going on in the Nazi death camps, and it was the Polish London government that first tried to spread to the world this information. That the world chose to ignore their message is hardly the fault of the Polish government. And here you see a copy of the report published by the Foreign Ministry of the London government at the end of 1942 concerning the genocide taking place in German-occupied Poland. Thirdly, Poles will often, rightly, point out that they took no part in the administration of the death camps. The Germans used Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and of course German guards at the concentration camps and the death camps. The Poles did not run the gas chambers. And with a few isolated exceptions, Poles did not participate in the Nazi police actions to round up the Jews and send them to the death camps, as disgracefully some Ukrainians in the western part of the country did. Just a few years ago, the Polish government announced that it was planning to change the name of Auschwitz from the original Polish name to the infamous, now infamous, German name, to emphasize the point that it was a German-run death camp, not a Polish one. And also, just a few years ago, back in 2007, I believe it was, the Polish government petitioned the UN organization in charge of the administration of World Historic Sites, the UNESCO organization, to change the name of the official historical site of Auschwitz and to designate it as a German-run death camp in Poland, to emphasize that while it was in Poland, the shame and horror of Auschwitz is not one that should be visited upon the Polish people. The Polish name should not be besmirched with the memory of what happened at Auschwitz. Many Poles will say in the end, what more could we have done? We were a defeated people as well. We too lived under Nazi occupation. We too lost 3 million of our own. And To be fair, in the final analysis, there was nothing the Poles could have done to stop the Nazis. Individual Jews could be and were saved by individual Poles, but the overall murderous intent of the Holocaust could not have been stopped, it seems, even had the Poles done more, as Błąski suggested that they should have done. Right? To hide a Jew, we have to remember this, to hide a Jew took real courage. After October 1941, Nazi law on the ground in Poland made it a crime punishable by death. And I think we'd all like to imagine that we ourselves possess the requisite courage, that we certainly would have risked life and limb to help another person in peril. It's problematic, I think, for us 70 years later to stand here safe and secure and to criticize individuals for not possessing sufficient courage under the kind of appalling circumstances that prevailed at the time. And we have to understand the historical context here, right? So the point of all this, as I've tried to suggest, is that the story of occupied Poland, the story of heroic resistance and varying degrees of collaboration or indifference, is a difficult one. The truth is tangled between all sorts of competing strands of historical memory and national sentiment. And so where does this leave us? I mean, how do we view the Poles and their role in World War II? Were the Poles valiant freedom fighters resisting the Nazis, as we see again and again in so many Polish films and books from the post-war period? Or were the Poles anti-Semitic thugs eager to help the Nazis rid Poland of its Jews even as they tried to fight the Germans? Well, the problem, of course, lies in the very way we pose that question, the very way that many Poles and Jews today pose those questions. We could go through all day long examples of Polish heroism and Polish bravery, hiding Jews beneath beds or in root cellars. And we could stand here and recite countless examples of Polish villainy and cruelty as well, or neglect. But these kind of dueling examples, I think, don't get us very far. Ultimately, I would argue, when we think about what happened in Poland in the period 1939 to 1945, these questions of culpability have to be determined on an individual basis. We can't assign collective guilt to an entire nation, just as we can't heap collective praise or absolution on an entire nation or people. So in the final analysis, I mean, the way I rather disingenuously phrase the question about the Poles and the Jews, we can't talk of what the Poles did to the Jews during the war, or how the Poles and the Jews interacted during the war. These monolithic ethno-national categories have to be broken down. In the end, in the final analysis, all we can do, I think, is talk of what individual Poles did, what individual Jews did. Were there individual Polish heroes? Undoubtedly. Were there individual Polish scoundrels? Absolutely. Were all Poles anti-Semites? Of course not. Were there anti-Semitic Poles? Absolutely. I mean, the sad truth is that, yes, anti-Semitism in various shapes and degrees has played a role in Polish history, just as racism in various shapes and forms has played a role in the history of the United States. That's a fact. That is not, however, to say that the Polish national character or culture is inherently anti-Semitic, or that the Polish national culture is defined by anti-Semitism. A statement like this would be both offensively incorrect and absurd. But it is to say that we can't understand Polish history and how that history has been and continues to be remembered without at least grappling with this issue. I think these questions lead in nicely to a discussion of Jan Gross's Neighbors. I'll leave you with a quote here. In a response to the Błąski article published in the late 1980s, the Polish writer Janina Walewska spoke for many Poles when she wrote this: "My guilt, which bordered on cruelty, was my indifference to the fate of the Jews. I was completely indifferent to the human beings who were perishing in the ghetto. They were them and not us." And that indifference, the inability or unwillingness of many Poles to see the Jews as us, speaks volumes, I think. the indifference with which Poles looked upon the fate of their Jewish neighbors, whom they did not see as us, but whom they saw rather as them. That memory, the memory of indifference, is what Błonski brought to national attention in 1987, and is a question which is still being wrestled with today. We see it in the work of Jan Gross. Gross, a Polish-born scholar working in the United States, currently a professor of history at Princeton. Gross published Neighbors in 2000, and the book has received both acclaim and controversy here in the United States and in Gross's native Poland. Love it or hate it, and as we'll see, many readers were incensed by Gross's book, there's no denying that it's an important work. Important because the episode that Gross lays out here in his micro-historical analysis, the massacre of Polish Jews by their Polish neighbors in the small eastern market town of Jedwabne, challenges so powerfully that historical memory of Poland's role in the Second World War, challenging the notion of Poland and the Poles solely as victims of Nazi aggression. And this is a theme we'll likely return to in our discussion this week. How does Neighbors oblige us to rethink the memories and narratives that have come out of the war? Because at Jedwabne, the Poles were not simply bystanders, witnesses to German atrocities, nor, in this instance, were they the victims of German crimes. Here they perpetrated them themselves. So, a few points to think about as you read this very short but very powerful book. What happened in Jedwabne and why? Here's one of many maps, sort of reconstructions of the center of Jedwabne and the sort of sites of activity on that fateful day, July 10th, 1941. What sorts of factors does Gross introduce into his analysis to help us understand why ethnic Poles killed their Jewish neighbors on July 10th, 1941? What motivated them to do so? The murder was carried out by Poles. But what was the role of the Germans in all of this? That's a question that Gross introduces, and is very important, I think, to understanding what happened that day. Now, Gross was not the first to discover that horrible crimes had been perpetrated at Jedwabne in the summer of 41, and his book takes us through the kind of detective work that led him to amass the evidence and sift through the written records and reconstruct what happened there on that fatal day. And it's a classic example of how historians work. One of the great things about the book, I think, is that you get this sort of insight into the methodology of historical research and writing and how it's done by a master like Gross. But again, Gross was not the first to uncover that this had happened. He was the first to show that this massacre was not the work of Germans, but that it was the work of Poles. Back in the 1960s, a stone monument was set up in Jedwabne by the Polish communist government. And the inscription is very interesting. The inscription read, "The site of the suffering of the Jewish population. Here, the Gestapo and the Nazi police burned alive 1,600 people on July 10th, 1941. And that stone marker stood for several decades. But after Gross's book came out, that monument was removed, and a new one was erected in 2001 on the 60th anniversary of the massacre at Jedwabne. And here you see the new monument. It reads in Polish, Hebrew, and Yiddish, quote, "In memory of the Jews of Jedwabne and the surrounding areas, men, women, and children, cohabitants of this land, murdered and burned alive here on July 10th, 1941. You see the stones on the top of the monument. In the Jewish tradition, mourners will often leave stones behind at the gravesites of the deceased as a sort of permanent reminder that those who are gone are not forgotten. Flowers wilt and die, but the stones remain. And you see that here on the side, photographs of the victims, names of the victims have been affixed, just taped up by descendants and mourners. The inscription here is interesting for two reasons. One, I think the description of the Jews of Yedvabne and the surrounding areas, men, women, and children, as cohabitants of this land, right? That they lived on and shared this land with ethnic Poles for centuries. That they were cohabitants there. They weren't just in transit. They weren't just passing through. That this was their land too. And that's an admission that's absent in the earlier monument, to be sure. Secondly, no mention, as you'll notice, no mention in this monument of the Nazis. Right? But neither does the monument admit Polish guilt or culpability. The inscription uses a passive construction here that obscures agency. We're told that the Jews of Yedvabne were murdered and burned alive, but by whom? The monument doesn't say. 10 years later, after this monument was built, in 2011, the memorial was defaced by swastikas painted on it by unknown vandals. And among the slogans painted on the monument, they were flammable, referring to the Jews who were burned. And I don't apologize for Yedvabne. The Polish government condemned the vandalism, as did the media and voices across Poland. Here you see the swastika defacing the monument. The inscription here in Polish at the top, partially wiped out by green paint. In 2001, and here you see the removal of the graffiti. In 2001, a German journalist traveled to Poland and published a series of interviews with Poles who had lived through the war and occupation and aftermath. And by that point, many of the individuals with whom he spoke were quite elderly. The journalist asked his interviewees what they thought of Gross's book, whether they'd read it, and even if they hadn't read it, what they thought about the issues that it raised, how they made sense of the book's revelation that Poles, not Germans, had perpetrated the massacre of Jews at Yedvabne. And a 70-year-old Polish man had this to say to his German interviewer. We were taught as children that we Poles never harmed anyone. A partial abandonment of this morally comfortable position is very, very hard for me. It's a telling statement, I think. For one, the explicit admission that narratives of national victimhood and suffering and national innocence are morally comfortable is remarkably forthright, I think. And also the admission of this 70-year-old Polish man that to abandon those morally comfortable positions is very, very hard. Very, very hard. And if nothing else, I think, Gross's book has obliged Poles to look more critically at their nation's past, to look at what the former Polish president Aleksander Kwaśniewski has called the black pages of history, pages that continue to be filled in by historians today. And these are themes, and others too, that we will bring up in our discussion this week. Thanks.